Gandalf facing off against the Balrog is one of the most iconic scenes from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings film series. Gandalf names it the Balrog of Morgoth. But what exactly is a Balrog of Morgoth? Who is Morgoth? Are Balrogs just forces of darkness sworn to oppose the light? Or are they something else entirely? Let's take a look. Balrogs are the creation of J.R.R. Tolkien, appearing throughout his legendarium. They have also appeared in video games, movies, and it looks like we will get to see one in the Rings of Power TV series, but more on this later. Most of us are probably familiar with Peter Jackson's depictions of a Balrog in the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers movies, where we see Gandalf face off against a towering fire demon, a creature of shadow and flame with immense wings that wields a flaming sword and a fiery whip. The Balrog is a fearsome creature, filling the Fellowship with dread and slays their most powerful member. This moment was always my favourite in the entire trilogy, seeing this wizard face off against a literal demon, and when Gandalf delivers the iconic, "You shall not pass," I always get goosebumps. This specific Balrog is named Durins Bane, who we are told was awoken by the dwarves after they dug too deep and greedily. They unearthed a nameless terror in the depths below, a Balrog. The great demon awoke and wrought destruction throughout Khazad-dûm, slaying countless dwarves, including Durin VI, the king of Khazad-dûm. The Balrog was henceforth known as Durins Bane. The dwarves were completely driven from their kingdom, and it was renamed Moria, the Black Pit. In the Peter Jackson movies, the Balrog is represented as a demon, a beast made of flame and shadow, with immense horns, a tail, cloven feet, and other attributes that are classically associated with a demon. But as iconic as this imagery is, in the books and Tolkien's extended work, Balrogs are described a little bit differently. Gandalf also provides a hint at the creature's origins when he names it a Balrog of Morgoth. But who or what is Morgoth? To understand the Balrog's appearance, we must first take a look at its origins. It might surprise you to learn that Gandalf and the Balrog are the same type of being. Although Gandalf may just appear as an old man who can wield powerful magics, and the Balrog appears as an otherworldly demon, the pair are actually both Maya, primordial spirits that were created to help the Valar to first shape the world. Essentially, think of them as lesser angels, immortal beings who exist as formless spirits, though they are capable of shapeshifting and can manifest into almost any form they desire. Gandalf took the form of an old man to convey a sense of wisdom and trust, but the Balrogs took the form of monstrous demons to serve but one purpose: war. Balrogs were Maya, corrupted by Morgoth, who was also known as Melkor. Morgoth was the original villain of Tolkien's Legendarium. He desired above all to create, but that power was reserved for Eru Ilúvatar, the god of this universe. For this reason, Morgoth grew jealous and rebelled against Eru. Although incapable of true creation, Morgoth could still corrupt and mutate Eru's creations. Incidentally, this is how orcs were made. From elves, the first children of Eru, Morgoth was able to capture and twist them into abominations, making a mockery of both Eru and his children. In his rebellion, Morgoth drew some Maya to his cause and corrupted them. Sauron himself was among these Maya, though Sauron was not turned into a Balrog, acting more as Morgoth's right-hand man. Morgoth needed beings to actually fight his wars, and formed these other Maya into something different, transforming them into Balrogs. These Balrogs were amongst Morgoth's greatest warriors, and were devastating on the battlefield. Morgoth used the Balrogs in Valinor when he and Ungoliant destroyed the two trees of Valinor, the main light source before the creation of the sun. Ungoliant was an eldritch primordial being that was capable of drinking the light of the two trees of Valinor, plunging the world into darkness for a time. As Morgoth continued to wage war against Eru Ilúvatar, the Balrogs were amongst his most devastating weapons, capable of astonishing feats of destruction. Eventually, Morgoth was defeated in the War of Wrath, and his forces were largely destroyed or scattered. Among these scattered forces were the Balrogs. We know the resting place of at least one Balrog, Durins Bane. I mentioned earlier that Balrogs are described differently to what we saw in the Peter Jackson movies. The Balrogs in Tolkien's works took the form of humanoid figures surrounded by shadow and flame, with streaming fiery manes that wielded flaming swords and fiery whips. Though this might seem pretty accurate to the Balrog we saw in the movies, they were most notably smaller and more man-like, with no mention of cloven hooves or horns, features that we did see on the Balrog in the films. We are given the following description of a Balrog when the Fellowship encounters one in Moria. What it was could not be seen. It was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form, or man-shaped maybe, yet greater. And a power and terror seemed to be in it and to go before it. It came to the edge of the fire, and the light faded, as if a cloud had bent over it. Then, with a rush, it leapt across the fissure. The flames roared up to greet it and wreathed about it, and a black swirling smoke in the air. Its streaming mane kindled, and a blaze behind it. In its right hand was a blade like a stabbing tongue of fire. In its left, it held a whip of many tongues. Here we are told the Balrog is roughly a man-shaped humanoid, shrouded in shadow and flame, with a great fiery mane wielding a flaming sword and huge whip. Upon witnessing the creature, the Fellowship are filled with a profound sense of dread. Gandalf faltered, Gimli dropped his axe, and Legolas wails. Clearly, this creature is powerful beyond measure to elicit such a reaction. But this description does not seem to indicate a great winged demon with cloven hooves and horns that we see in the film. The story moves on with the party fleeing, and when Gandalf faces off against it at the bridge of Khazad-dûm, we are given another description. The darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings spread from wall to wall. This section seems to indicate that the Balrogs do have wings. Whether they are functional or are just vestigial, we are not specifically told. Some of the Tolkien community believe Balrogs don't even have wings, and the language used to describe Durins Bane is just a poetic way that Tolkien used to show how the creature could extend its form by spreading the shadow it had control over to strike fear into its enemies. Gandalf seems capable of extending his form in a similar way. We see this in both the books and the films in Bag End. When Gandalf and the Balrog fall from the bridge of Khazad-dûm, the creature does not take flight, but instead falls. In the books, the chasm is notably larger when compared to the Balrog itself, so if it could fly, it seems to choose not to. In Tolkien's extended works, we hear of another Balrog that was slain by Glorfindel, a legendary elven warrior, who fought an epic duel with a Balrog on a cliffside and was able to cast it down, but was pulled down with the Balrog to both their deaths. Just as the Balrog that Gandalf faced, this one does not seem to fly while falling from a great height. It seems if it did in fact have wings, it could have simply spread its wings and flown to safety. Though admittedly, it is unclear if Glorfindel slew the Balrog and then it fell, or if the Balrog died due to the fall. In all of Tolkien's works, there is no unambiguous references to Balrogs having wings or being able to fly, which would seem to indicate that they did not have wings, and from the other descriptions listed, they are described more human-like than the demon we saw in Peter Jackson's films. Despite this, Peter Jackson and his team ultimately depicted the Balrog as a towering being shrouded in shadow and flame, with vast wings, cloven hooves, and horns, which, undeniably, is a fearsome sight. So we just heard of Glorfindel and the Balrog he slew, as well as Gandalf and Durins Bane. But how many Balrogs were there? This question, like the appearance of Balrogs, is another difficult one to answer. Tolkien's lore grew and changed as he was writing it over the decades. Early on, he seemed to indicate that they numbered in the thousands. But as the lore grew, Tolkien seemed to change his mind, stating that there is as few as 3 or as many as 7 to have ever existed. So this seems to be where he landed on their total number. Of the 7, we only know the name of one other, Gothmog, who was the lord of the Balrogs, and the greatest Balrog to have ever walked Middle-earth. He is described as being similar to the other Balrogs we hear of, save for the fact that he wielded a great black axe. Gothmog slew Fëanor, the first king of the Noldor elves, who was perhaps the greatest elf to have ever lived. Fëanor was the creator of the Silmarils, 3 legendary jewels crafted from the essence of the 2 trees of Valinor. These Silmarils were immensely important in the history of Tolkien's Legendarium, and a topic best saved for a future video. Gothmog fought another duel with Ecthelion of the Fountain, who was disarmed by the Balrog but ran forward into the Balrog Lord, ramming his pointed helmet into the demon's chest, forcing it into the Fountain of the King. The waters quenched the flames of Gothmog, and the pair drowned. So there are clearly a number of Balrogs that have existed in Middle-earth. So how and which ones will appear in the Rings of Power? The Rings of Power trailer seems to indicate that we will get to see at least one Balrog, represented in a similar form as the Peter Jackson Balrog. The Rings of Power is supposed to be set during the Second Age, where we are specifically told that Sauron gathered all the evil things of the days of Morgoth that remained on the earth and beneath it. But we do not hear of any Balrogs being rallied to his side. It could be that the Balrogs did not have a willingness to follow Sauron, who was significantly less powerful than their previous Dark Lord. And if the Balrogs had been active in the Second Age, we certainly would have heard of them in Tolkien's writings. So how can one appear in the Rings of Power? The most likely way is through a series of flashbacks to the First Age, specifically during the War of Wrath, where Morgoth was finally defeated. I imagine a scene reminiscent of the last alliance of men and elves at the beginning of the Peter Jackson films. These scenes of the War of Wrath in the TV show will be used to provide some prehistory to the show and will inform the events that will take place in the series. But what do you think? Do Balrogs have wings? Was Peter Jackson's depiction a true representation of these creatures? For me, it certainly was. And how do you think they will show Balrogs in the Rings of Power?